Speaking to you from my home office here on the unceded territories of the Coast Salish Territory and the Lekwungen and Wasanich Nations. Royal Roads University, where I work typically, is situated on the ancestral lands of the Kosamson and Lekwungen families who shared those beautiful and inspiring lands and resources with neighboring families of the Xianu and Suk Nations and many others. I feel really privileged to live and work and play where I do. And I say that recognizing that, first of all, I'm an uninvited guest, a settler descendant, and recognizing that with that, I have a responsibility for continuing to listen and learn from Indigenous people, to continue to move the decolonizing agenda forward, and to give thanks to those nations and families and all their ancestors who for millennia have protected and respected these lands and the resources, who share their wisdom even today and inspire really a better way of being in the world. So to those people and to their ancestors, Haichkasiyam. Changing the narrative. This webinar really is about stories and changing how we approach, how we talk about climate change. We've known about human-caused climate change for decades, centuries really. And yet, despite urgent calls for action by scientists and youth and others, stories about the dire consequences of climate change and the existential threat it poses, there's been limited success really in inspiring the society-wide transformative changes that we are needing now in our behaviors, our dominant cultural attitudes and economic models, and our relationship in the dominant culture with nature and with other species and each other and with the planet itself. We know that we need rapid, widespread engagement and upskilling right across society, every sector, in order to reduce greenhouse gases, GHG emissions, sufficiently to avoid those catastrophic predictions. And we know that we need a huge upsurge in an understanding and preparation for and adaptation to the climate-related risks and impacts that are already locked in and that we will not be able to avoid. We've already surpassed the 1 degree threshold, and it's almost certain that we will surpass the 1.5 degree threshold laid out by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the IPCC. We also know that there's a lag between whatever we do now to get to net zero emissions and what happens in the atmosphere. When you think about GHG gases, you can sort of think like an insulation blanket or warming blanket. Even when you turn it off, that warming blanket continues to heat and hold the heat for a period of time. So the already released gases, GHG emissions, we know will remain in the atmosphere for thousands of years. In human terms, those carbon and GHG emissions and gases are essentially there forever, for our lifetime and beyond, unless we find ways to remove them, which is possible, but at this point, we still have no way of really doing that effectively in a widespread way. So in order to effectively slow down global warming, we'd have to eliminate all greenhouse gases, carbon dioxide, methane, nitrous oxide, and we would have to reverse things like deforestation. We'd have to use and dramatically change land use practices in agriculture, mining, construction, how we build our communities. We'd also need to affect a level of global cooperation that to date has eluded us and has yet been unprecedented. So yes, in theory, we can eliminate additional planetary warming, but we're a long way off from doing that. If we eliminated the use of all fossil fuel today, everyone stopped using it altogether throughout the world, scientists project that after about 40 years, the planet's climate would stabilize, still at a higher temperature than previously normal. So that's a decades-long lag, and that is only if we are globally able to do this. And again, to date, there's little evidence that suggests we will accomplish this goal, other than the fact that we are a very creative and innovative species when push comes to shove. Based on current scientific projections, we are on track without those kinds of transformative changes for a world that is 2 degrees warmer or as much as 4 degrees warmer by the end of the decade. And that will have catastrophic implications for all species, not just humans. So this means that we need to not only reduce emissions rapidly, but also rapidly build capacity to adapt across all society. And these are the facts. And this is the story that I and others often tell. But told this way, it's more likely to inspire a sense of hopelessness than hope, a sense of anxiety instead of empowerment, and a sense of apathy rather than action. And we've seen lots of evidence of that. So somehow we have to change the narrative in ways that convey the urgency of the crisis while also conveying possibility. We need stories that invite and motivate and help individuals and communities, businesses and governments to see a way forward and to believe that they can do something individually and collectively, make a difference. We need narratives that support the necessary goal of achieving net zero while simultaneously supporting people's understanding of local and regional climate risks and impacts, and inspiring actions to reduce those risks and increase the resilience of people and ecosystems, and obviously to do that in just and equitable ways. So we need narratives that really inspire and collectively motivate transformative change in how we are in the world, how we relate to nature and to other species, and how we relate to each other and our shared future. So today's webinar brings together three storytellers, three people who bring very different backgrounds and worldviews, views and social locations, different personal and professional experiences to share their thoughts on how to change the narrative and why this is important and what alternative narratives are needed. So Johanna, I keep saying Johanna Wagstaffe is the meteorologist, seismologist, and scientist for CBC Vancouver and CBC News Network. Johanna's background in seismology and earth sciences, and this has led her to cover major earthquake and seismic events, wildfires, hurricanes, and the Copenhagen and Paris climate change conferences. She's also hosted 3 award-winning CBC podcasts, including Fault Lines, 2050 Degrees of Change, and she's the author of several children's science books. And this week she's guest hosting CBC's What on Earth series, a radio show exploring questions and ideas and feelings about climate change. So welcome, Johanna. We also have Denise Withers, who's a narrative strategist who helps clients across sectors use story design to do things like protect ecosystems and advance clean energy, reduce chronic disease, and boost economic development. She's got a background in documentary filmmaking, and her stories have been seen by millions of people around the world on channels like CBC and the National Geographic, SSSIR, the UN and Financial Post, and the Discovery channels. Her book, Story Design, offers a new approach to creating change that helps us identify stories that stand in our way and replace them with better ones that show us how to move forward. Kwahagang, or James McGuire, is a citizen of the Haida Nation. His work and passion includes bridging Haida knowledge and art and oral histories with Western science to communicate the lessons of the past on Haida Gwaii and how they might help to inform our collective movement towards the future. The lessons of his ancestors inform a balanced way of interacting with the natural world. James expresses his passion through many avenues as a musician with Haida rock and roll trio Jason Camp and the Posers, as a cultural singer and dancer, a student of Haida oral histories, a tour guide with Haida style expeditions, working in collections at the Sahalindanai Haida Gwaii Museum, where he is today, and producing award-winning films. So welcome to you all. I wonder if we can lose the slides there, Christy, and see our folks. I'd like to start by giving each of our speakers 5 minutes to share some of their core thoughts on the topic of storytelling, narrative traditions, and what you see as important about stories in the context of the climate crisis. I guess the question really is, how can we amplify this power and potential of stories that we share about climate change to affect and motivate people differently to become leaders of climate action? So I'm going to start with you, Johanna, if you would.
Well, first of all, it's a pleasure to be here. It's so nice to see so many of you dialing in. I am really looking forward to this discussion. I'm coming to you from sunny North Vancouver, so I'd like to acknowledge that I'm on the unceded territory of the Squamish, Musqueam, and Tsleil-Waututh territories. So yeah, I'm really looking forward to this chat because the idea of using a narrative, using stories to convey the urgency of climate change is something that I think about all the time. I think about this every day, and I've been thinking about this for a long time. I want to take you back to when I first started as a meteorologist about 15 years ago to the CBC Weather Center. So coming in as a scientist, so I already loved facts. As a science communicator, it was trying to figure out how to convey the facts of the weather each day to our audience. And I got to work with meteorologist Claire Martin, one of the original meteorologists out here at CBC, if anyone knows her. And I was asking her, how do I remember all of the numbers? It's 4 degrees in Prince George, it's 3 degrees in the Kootenays. How do I turn that into a 2-minute weather spot? And how am I going to remember all of that? And, she said, turning that into a narrative and using the other information that we have. And we spent all morning analyzing the weather. Let's use that to help tell the story of what's happening today. So the first thing I do, even if it's just creating a forecast for the South Coast, is figure out what the message is that I'm trying to get across. And I didn't do a full analysis this morning, but today I had a quick look, and the message that I would want to get across to everyone today is that we've sort of had a few good sunny cloudy days on the South Coast, and that's because there's been a bit of a fight between this swirling low pressure sitting off of Washington and a nice high pressure in place, and they've sort of been going back and forth, and today high pressure has won out, so we get to have a sunny day for the most part. And using a narrative, even a simple narrative like that, not only helps me remember what I want to say, but it sticks with the audience as well. I think they're much more likely to remember what's going on, the bigger picture, than if I just said it's 3 degrees in Vancouver. And I think that really translated as I moved forward, fast forward 15 years, and now I'm getting to tell the story of climate change through so many different platforms and learning how to do it and constantly evolving, from the 2-minute spot on the evening news to social media, to radio programs, to podcasting, and to children's books. I mean, they're all different narratives, but it all comes down to trying to figure out how to tell that story. And I think in creating the 2050 Climate Change podcast, I really spent some time thinking about how to turn that into a story. And that's why I ended up using the voice of a 12-year-old in 2050 to go through the story of her life in the future to help convey what's happening now. And even though I think using people and talking to people about how their own friends and families are and will be affected is the most powerful tool, I still think that there is a role for a 2-minute spot on the latest science study, as long as we can tell that story as a story. And that's something that I'm really looking forward to talking to Denise and James about, that I think that there is a great place for the big stories, but I'd also argue, here's the scientists coming out, that there's a spot for the latest, melting ice study as well. So I'm really looking forward to this chat and to learning from both of you. So thanks for having me.
Thanks, Johanna. I agree with your both and approach. James, would you like to weigh in for about 5 minutes on your thoughts on the power of narrative and oral traditions in how we tell this story?
Sure. Good evening or good morning, everybody. My name is Kwahagang of the Gakiel's Kigwe clan in Skadans. I'm a Haida citizen, and I'm coming to you from my own territory, Paraguay, in South Lindonai Paraguay Museum, and Hawa for joining us from whatever territories you're on. For our people, stories and oral histories have given us examples of the different changes we've gone through over, the 14,000 plus years that we've existed here, and many other Indigenous people have existed for that, that long, if not longer, in their own territories. And all of us have these stories that reflect the ever-changing environment around us. And as I thought it would be a great room in our museum to come to you from, this room in here, because this room has all the supernatural women that guided us through many different climate change catastrophes, honestly. And right behind me over here is Kwahagang. And her story is, it goes After a great period of warmth came the Ice Age. As everything cooled, snow and ice appeared, making its way down the mountains of Haida Gwaii, as well as over the mainland. We just call it over there, the mainland. When it became too cold, Kwahagang guided our people to a warmer climate in the Puget Sound area, where we lived for many generations until it warmed back up and we returned home to Haida Gwaii. So this is just a quick example of a nice little story that it follows a deity who helped guide us away from potential climate disaster, but also tells of a long historical existence in one place and one coast, and adapting to many different changes as they came. And our people over thousands of generations have adapted to many different changes and will continue to adapt as they come. Our people have been here for over 14,000 years. We've been through ice ages, we've been through long droughts, we've been through tsunamis and floods, earthquakes. We've been through many different changes, and will continue to be here. We've been through smallpox, we've been through everything you can, pushed to the brink of existence, and we continue on. And what guides us through that is our oral history and our guiding principles. And so, as I ramble on, that's basically what I'm here to share with you, is some of those examples.
Thank you, James, and not rambling at all. Clear, story of enormous resilience in the face of enormous challenges, not least of which is colonization. Thank you, Denise. Can I ask you to share your thoughts on that question of how we use stories in a different way?
Yeah, thanks so much, Robin. So I'm coming to you from Kwahagang Beach on Vancouver Island, which is the traditional territory of the Coast Salish and the Comox people. And it's really an incredible place. And I feel, unbelievably fortunate to be able to live here and share in the resources here. As Robin said, I was a documentary filmmaker for quite a long time, working primarily for Discovery Channel. And really in my heart, it took me a long time to realize this, but I was really an educator. So I was using stories to teach people. And so a lot of the work that I did was kind of science translation. Stories about, we did the first documentary series about GMOs, what was DNA? How did it work? How could we use it? All those kinds of things. And for the longest time, that was enough for me, because I loved learning and I loved being able to translate those complex topics and help other people understand them. And eventually I got to the point where I realized that education is not enough. Education moves us a little ways along the change spectrum, but it often doesn't get us to where we need to be to inspire action. And the real learning for me came when I did a project for General Romeo Dallaire, if anybody remembers him. So he led the UN mission in Rwanda during the Rwandan genocide. He suffered from post-traumatic distress disorder, as did everybody who served with him. And at the time, the Canadian military really wasn't acknowledging that PTSD existed. They weren't treating it. They weren't preparing people for it. And a lot of people were losing their lives because of it. So he hired me to do a documentary about what had happened to his people during the Rwandan genocide. And I remember very clearly the first time I met him, he brought me into his office and he sat me down, and he sat higher than me at the end of a big table. And he looked down the end of the table and he looked me in the eye and he said, "If you don't make people cry, you failed." And I thought, all right, there's my challenge. And we went off and we did the documentary, and honestly, everybody cried. And honestly, it wasn't that hard because it was such a tragic story. But that documentary became the trigger for the Canadian Armed Forces to develop and implement post-traumatic stress disorder policies and treatment and for all of their personnel. It became required viewing for everybody. And that was the first time I realized that we could do more than just use stories to inform and educate. We could use stories to tap into people's emotions and to inspire change. So not long after that, reality TV came along and it really killed the documentary industry. And so I left, I went back to grad school and I started to study this thing called engagement, this thing called narrative, how we learn what goes on at an emotional level. And I ended up combining that with design thinking, which is, a big business trend these days, and realizing that if we start to be much more strategic about how we design our stories, we can design them explicitly to have specific impacts. And, you know, the marketing and advertising industry has been doing this for decades. They're way ahead of us in this. They know very well how to manipulate people and how to influence people. And so a lot of the work that I've been doing over the last 15 years has been coming in with social purpose clients. So everything from environmentalists to conservationists to scientists working in clean energy, and helping them figure out who they need to move, where they need to move them to, and how we can use stories to do that. And I think for the purposes of our conversation today, there's a couple of things that I want to throw out there. And one is that there's a lot of neuroscience these days that is showing that we are actually pretty much hardwired to respond to stories. So when I tell you a story, the same parts of your brain light up as my brain. It's mind-blowing. So you feel the same things that I feel. So that's really important, because when I tell you a story, you can have the same experience as me. So when we're talking about trying out new things, which is what we're going to have to do as we work to advance, you know, tackle climate change, and we talk about what it might be like to live and drive an electric car, I can share my experience of driving an electric car with you. You can have that experience in a safe way and think about whether it's something or you know, you want to try or not. So that's really a really important piece. The other thing that I've realized is you cannot change what people think, say, or do until you change the stories they tell themselves. I'm convinced of that. And so rather than treating storytelling as a communication activity that we tack on at the end of developing new technologies or developing new strategies, we need to start with the stories. What are the stories that we're telling ourselves that are holding us back? And what are better stories that we can tell that will inspire people to take action? And I think that's the piece that's missing these days. We don't hear our leaders telling us inspired stories about how much better our lives can be in the future. You know, and I'll stop talking in a second. We had during the pandemic, people were talking about how with no cars on the road, the air was cleaner and we could hear the birds and the streets were beautiful. We're not talking about what life could be like, how much better it could be. We're only talking about the pain points. And nobody wants to buy into a story about how their life is going to suck, right? So we need to figure out how we're going to tap into the positive stories and the hopeful stories going forward.
Yeah, thank you for that, Denise. And it's a great segue into maybe unpacking that. You've all shared some examples of stories, whether it's around weather or, you know, these millennia long oral traditions, or the stories that you've been working on with clients. So I'm wondering if you collectively, and I'll, you know, anyone can jump in and start this, how to sort of unpack the stories, the narratives, and what are some of those ways of telling stories, whether it's the content or the way in which the story is told, that can achieve that, what you've just described, Denise, that shift from, I mean, I think awareness is important and we need that as a place to start, but motivating action and feeling some sense of empowerment about it. So what's in there that we can learn, either from examples that you have and or just from thinking about how we sort of unpack that and help people tell those different stories?
Well, I mean, I'll just kick it off. I think one of the things that we're not doing is we're not telling stories about specific people, right? So people want to see themselves in a story. They need to see somebody that they can relate to. And when we're telling abstract stories at a really high level about what's going on, it's really hard for people to connect to that and say, oh, I see myself in that. And so one of the really interesting projects that's going on right now is in Sweden. They actually have hired a guy. It's my dream job. He's the chief he's the chief storyteller for climate change. He works for an organization called Viable Cities. And his job over the next 10 years is going to be to create stories that help Swedish citizens see themselves in a climate altered future. And so he talks about things like, you might be going on a family vacation and you're still going to go on a family vacation and the kids are still going to be in the back of the car and they're still going to be fighting, but you'll be driving an electric car, right? Just little things like that. So how do we help people see themselves in the stories?
And Johanna, you mentioned 2050 degrees of change and the way you use the persona of a 12-year-old. So what are your thoughts on that question of like that and other strategies in terms of how we have to weave our stories in different ways?
Yeah, I really liked that example, Denise, of a an assigned or hired storyteller, I think a lot about a story that actually is rooted in seismology and earthquakes, but I think about it often. So Los Angeles gets a lot of earthquakes, and they're going to get a big earthquake one day. And a few years ago, the mayor of LA, really passionate about protecting, he's been a citizen, his family's been a citizen of Los Angeles for a long time. So, the rare mayor that wants to do a lot in his term, and actually hired a seismologist to be part of his staff to help communicate to stakeholders the importance of retrofitting and putting money into buildings. And the scientist Lucy Jones, the seismologist out of LA, sort of presented all the facts, all of the different risks. You have a 30% chance of a magnitude 7, and there's sort of blank stares, and no one did much. But Lucy thought about it and told the story of what would happen if a magnitude 7.5, and she illustrated that, in modeling, and talked specifically about businesses, what would happen to families, who would be cut off, what kind of infrastructure would change. And she said, here's what will happen if this magnitude 7.5 earthquake happens. So you've got two choices. You can either retrofit on your own, or we'll assign an engineer to come around to all of your houses and put it, or all of your buildings, and put a sticker on the door so everyone knows how poorly prepared your building is. And businesses and stakeholders went ahead and did the retrofitting themselves, sort of being able to visualize that story. So I think that's a very relevant topic when it comes to climate change. It's a tough story because even though we do have these galvanizing moments where people unfortunately are affected and impacted, and those are obvious opportunities to talk about climate change when an event is unfolding, but the bigger picture, the what happens to our futures, our children's futures, I think this tool to be able to tell a story in the future is really useful.
James, what about you? I mean, you've already shared a long lasting story of people being saved from the ice age, and bringing in ancestors and those supernatural beings to tell those stories. And in conversations that we've had, you've talked about how, yes, there are these long lasting oral traditions throughout the world. It's not just in Indigenous people in North America, but every culture has storytelling as part of it. And you talked about I think that you used the term long-term science. So the narrative of climate change has predominantly framed through Western science, but there's this other long-term science approach from Indigenous peoples. Can you speak a bit more about that and how that may offer a different way of engaging?
Yeah, sure. I mean, all of our stories, they all of stories that involve some sort of deity or something like that, they use the deity as a star, to get you engaged in that story, like Kaldajat, or like Skulujat over there, or you know what I mean? They use that example, and you really engage in that story. There's a protagonist, but what's being told around you is usually around that deity is usually a broader story of change that's happening, or a lesson that could be learned. And so, yeah, when I say that, oral histories of Indigenous people is an example of long-term science, we observe something for so long. 14,000 years is almost an unimaginable amount of time for a human consciousness. But with a collective consciousness of the community and structured story being passed down from a storyteller to an apprentice to a storyteller in a very strict fashion, that science, what's being observed gets basically written down, but in that person's brain, and those observations over time, they grow as the climate changes. We have examples of different fish rivers around here, like Copper Bay fish, sockeye around that. We have fished from for 10,000 years plus. The same family of fish has fed us over and over again, year after year. And over those 10,000 years of eating that sockeye, we have an oral history telling us about the different signs of change that will tell us what kind of run is coming and what we can expect for the year, whether or not we should be focusing on fishing something else to subsidize whether or not we're going to get that sockeye. And so now we have a Haida Fisheries Department that does modern science at that place. But what they're doing is they have when you're doing fishery management on a river, you set a fence up and you do a lot of counting to get a good estimate of how many salmon are coming in and how much will come back. But in the old days, we had a weir, and it's basically the same thing. And somebody would be in charge of looking at that and counting it and counting it and counting it and keeping track of how much salmon was coming and returning and breeding, and then the roe coming back into the ocean. And over time, we have that since we started the Haida Fisheries program, we have like 30 or 40 years of Western science but largely it's informed by the ancient practices of just monitoring the river. And many different examples of that, kind of happening. But that's just one that comes to mind for sure. Is we've been observing these ecosystems for so long that we understand the patterns of change that lead to a snowball effect. Like if a certain warm water fish shows up before its time, we can imagine that there's a warm South Pacific blob coming into the ocean. Or if we see something like albacore tuna coming, if we can fish it off the west coast of Haida Gwaii within 10 miles, it's likely that those warm water fish are following the warm South Pacific blob of ocean up here, and we can tell it's going to be this kind of a warm summer or a hectic winter based on the warm currents coming further north. There's all sorts of examples like that, and as you speak about them, they think about something that's happened, but all of that is explained in many different stories. Stories with these large deities like Raven and Kalgajad and Spulujad and Jilapuns and the oyster catcher. All these different stories are speaking about one thing, but they're really speaking about the climate changing over time. So yeah.
Yeah, I mean, the other thing I hear in there, James, and it sort of prompts my next question, is this sense that, so you all talked about having a protagonist, having characters in the story, creating a story that's accessible and relevant to people so that they can see themselves in it. And also in what you've just shared, James, this understanding that stories are deeply rooted in our cultures in different ways. And, a couple of years ago, I gave a talk to the Commission for Environmental Cooperation, kind of like the NAFTA for North America on environment, down in Mexico City, and talked about this need for a deep, a shift in our dominant cultural narrative, like the transformative changes that are required. As great as the sort of incremental recycling and using electric vehicles and those incremental choices are, we're at such a point in our history with climate change and the urgency of the crisis that we really need widespread transformative change. So I'm just curious about what your thoughts are about that deep sort of dominant culture narrative and how we start playing with that, which is a bit different than the stories of what we see ourselves in the everyday today, but that sense that we are guided by stories around our relationship with nature, the othering of nature, the othering of other species, the fact that resources are there for us to use as the dominant narrative. So just anyone can jump in. What are your thoughts on that?
I'll just start because it's something that I've been seeing a lot on social media, and I know we all know how interconnected climate change is and how so many of the crises that we're dealing with right now are actually interconnected. But I've noticed this movement on social media, intersectional environmentalism. And I've seen some nodding heads. I mean, I love that it's a youth-led movement. And I mean, but it comes down to this basic idea that the same systems that are in place that are allowing, inequality and racism to continue, those are the same systems that are allowing, big emitters to benefit and continue to make money. So going back to this idea of big systematic change, and as a journalist, I know it's something that we're starting to really talk about in our newsroom, and really only, honestly, in the past few years in a tangible way, talking about making sure we connect these big issues because they are so connected? And is it bringing in voices that you wouldn't traditionally think about hearing when it comes to climate change, and solving this big, question of systematic change, and how do we go about doing that? So yeah, I love that this is a topic that, for me in the newsroom anyway, is really come to the forefront in recent years.
Yeah, I mean, I've been following that. So I also do a lot of work in ocean conservation, and there's been a lot of research that's come out lately that shows that basically nature-based solutions, investing in nature, protecting wilderness, is the best way to tackle all of the crises that we're facing. And in fact, the World Economic Forum has a really great website, and I'm just going to look and see if I can see it. It's basically it's about nature-based solutions, and the challenge with that for me is that those stories, while I think they're powerful and I think they're absolutely where we want to go, are still relegated to the fringe. So we're seeing some, sort of consumer funded journalism that's happening. So organizations like the Years Project and the Conservation, the Conversation, who are bringing those stories out, but they're still relatively fringe. So I think that's part of the challenge. And then I think, Robin, to your point, we still have to figure out how do we start to shift the dominant narrative, which is really driven by economic value, right? We value, in North America, we value money, unfortunately. That's predominantly what drives us. And so little things like seeing Larry Fink from BlackRock, one of the huge investment firms, come out and say, actually, fossil fuels are dead. Stop investing in fossil fuels. Like that, talk about deities, James. Like, he's a deity, right? And he's the kind of person that we need to start saying those things. And that's where you start to have that kind of influence. But until we get leaders who are starting to tell those stories, we're still seeing our leaders predominantly investing in fossil fuels. So until they start to come out and say, actually, the best thing for our economic recovery coming out of COVID is going to be to invest in, alternative fuels, or whatever, however you want to frame that, I don't think we're going to start to see that shift.
Let's not forget that, I like you did speak about how, people are starting to realize, or especially, we've all realized that fossil fuel energy is an antiquated situation. It's a senseless investment for our people to make. We've seen that for a while, that big thing, but the governments continue to drive pipelines through Indigenous territories and things like that. And there is currently actions happening to try and stop that, to try and stop those sorts of things reaching our coast, and stop that the circulation of fossil fuels around the world. So I think that one thing to definitely do is to look for those actions happening, find out ways that you can support them. If you believe that fossil fuels are an antiquated situation, the ground action really does change things. Like, they're running pipelines through Indigenous territories, through burial grounds and things like that is a terrible thing to do for an antiquated, almost worthless what do you call it? Oil, basically. And we could help support those communities by backing those movements, the Wet'suwet'en people, the Kinder Morgan pipeline, and things like that, and putting your money where your mouth is, in that sort of, because they're happening now, and they've happened many times here in the 80s and 90s. Our elders and a few of our people stood on the line in Athlagwai and Lyle Island, in what is now known as Gwaihana, and stopped another antiquated thing that stopped clear cutting on Haida Gwaii, and saved millions and millions of trees, and helped save, in turn, millions of tons of oxygen, I imagine. Yeah. Just by taking direct action. And at the time, there was a lot of news coverage about it, and a lot of it was negative. And but now, as we look back 30 years later, we have a natural reserve that is one of the largest, and most beautiful, from the bottom of the ocean to the top of the highest mountain, because Indigenous people took action with the help of allies. 30 years ago, and it's something that we can be proud of, and it's something that we can move forward with. And here, you know, we have another opportunity to do something like that, to change the way we think about you know, about fossil fuels. And I think that, yeah, supporting those actions is a great way to try to move forward, because they're not always in the news, and but they are still going on.
Yeah, I mean, that raises a number of questions for me, one of which is maybe more specific to the way we tell these stories in you know, news media, not only news, but I mean, how, you know, you talked about how that story about clear cutting was represented, or how any of these stories are represented around the actions that people are taking to protect the environment and to try and, you know, change this around. I'm thinking about that. I also think about Greta Thunberg and how, you know, her story was shared in many positive ways, but also shared in some really, you know, with some real values attached to who she was, her age, her youth, what she was doing. So what is the role of, you know, there's an awareness of the values and assumptions that are in our stories. So how do we start building greater sort of, it's almost media savvy? It's not only news, but just how do we consume stories and understand that there are values in them? And maybe perhaps particularly to start us off, Johanna, you know, as a science communicator, as a scientist in the media, what can communications professionals like you do to enhance that strategic role in implementing widespread change and implementing and sharing the kinds of stories that are solutions-based, the example that James gave, or that really shift away from cultivating anxiety, which is not helpful. And we know there's lots of that and lots of mental health issues arising in the context of the climate crisis, and shift into action and move beyond.
Yeah, I think, I mean, first of all, what's been really optimistic to see for me as a science communicator in a newsroom is the shift in demand from our audience. I mean, you know, first we had, when I first started trying to connect the dots between climate and weather, you know, 15 years ago, it was really just a footnote. And you know, the demand from the audience, and especially because it was more of a one-way conversation back then, you know, we had the climate deniers, we had the trolls, and those continued on even as the two-way conversation on social media opened up. But it was, for me in the CBC newsroom, the back-to-back wildfires in British Columbia, the record wildfire seasons, where for the first time, our newsroom got more calls, more emails, more tweets from our audiences wanting to hear more about that connection to climate change and wanting to hear more about solutions than we did from the climate deniers. And so that was a real tipping point, I think, for the media in British Columbia. But moving forward, I think it continues to be so important to include or to make solution-based storytelling a huge part of what we do. And you mentioned, Robin, this radio show that I'm getting to be a part of this week. What on Earth? I thought it was really neat talking to the producer last week. She said every story that we do needs to have a challenge, a solution, and a heartbeat. And I thought, you know, in essence, that's sort of what I try and do on every platform, but to lay it out like that, and for that to be the mandate for our climate change storytelling was quite profound. And that is true. We need to prevent a challenge, but we always need to have a solution. And that's what the audience wants. And I think that's what we deserve to give them as climate change communicators. But the heartbeat part of the story is just as important, making sure that our audiences are connected to somebody in some way. So yeah, I'm continually learning, but I'm hopeful to see that the newsroom is learning and evolving along with me.
Yeah, so there's that demand side, but yeah, and you touch on, and in some ways both of you touched on that sort of emotional and values-based thing. And Denise, you had talked earlier about the story with Romeo Dallaire. What is the role of emotion? Because I mean, emotions, we can evoke emotions like anxiety and fear. We can also evoke empathy, as you've described. So can you talk a bit about that?
Yeah, you know, and it's funny because as a storyteller, I fought emotion in stories for a long time. I hated it. I just wanted the information, right? I was just such an information geek, and it took me a long time to realize the power of emotion to really move us.
Oh my gosh, Denise, I was the same. I was the exact same. I fought it for so long.
Yeah, and so I think, you know, what I've come to realize is that it is the emotion that moves us. And again, there's neuroscience behind this, right? There's chemicals that are released, and that's what engages us in these stories, and that's what makes us relate to the characters. So when we look at the kinds of stories that we need to tell, they need to be hopeful, and they need to talk about, I said this before, they need to talk about a better future, and we're not doing that, right? Like, even, if we look back at the wildfire stories, the stories that are going to resonate with us are going to be the stories of the helpers, the people who came in and, really made a difference. And then, like, I'm getting goosebumps when I talk about that, right? Like, or when we hear great leaders speak. I don't know if you listen to Joe Biden's inauguration speech, right? Every great leader kind of has a really nice way of bringing us into the future. Yes, things are terrible, but it doesn't have to be that way. Imagine if we did this, and imagine if we did that. And when you start to conjure up those imaginary scenarios, as soon as you situate the listener or the viewer in that imaginary scenario, they're going to get those same goosebumps that you get if you really believe in it, if you really commit to it. So I think telling those future stories and telling those positive stories is a really great way for us to make those connections. And I'm, coming back to the World Economic Forum, I don't work for them, but I love what they're doing. If you follow them on LinkedIn, they have quite regularly, they produce videos that are positive stories about solutions and innovation and what people are doing. So, that's kind of at the grand scale, what the media can do. But then when we talk about how do we stop making this a conservation story or making this a climate issue and start making it a mainstream issue, we can all tell these stories. So I had a client who has a clean energy solution that he's trying to sell. And he was trying to sell it based on the fact that it was a good thing to mitigate climate change, and nobody was buying. And I finally said, these people don't care about the planet. That's not what their value system is. But your solution is going to save them money. So that's the story you need to tell people, because that is going to resonate with them. It's going to save them money, and it's going to create jobs in their communities. And that's the story that's working for him. So it's knowing who your audience is. How do you explicitly design your stories to speak to their values and connect with their values?
Well, and again, that sort of raises the question. So there's the content and knowing your audience, but also the different mediums that we have for telling stories and the different ways that we can tell stories, visual, oral, etc. What role does that play, and how can we start thinking more creatively about that? Any of you?
We do tell these stories through media. That a lot of the movies and music and books that we all consume are telling these stories. It's whether or not we understand we're learning them. That's what I think the power of story is you can consume something so entertaining, right? And be completely enthralled with it and not even realize you learned an important lesson about your life. And so that's what I think, that just that alone is the power of story in enacting change within itself, is honestly the consumption of art, the consumption of anything. It's all interconnected, and it all helps you. That's why we do it. I think subconsciously that's why we do consume art and story and things like that, is to help ourselves grow. We're always wanting to grow and become better people. I don't think anybody wakes up in the morning and thinks I want to be a worse person today than I was yesterday. I think we all wake up thinking, in whatever way we can, how can we be better people? And
Right.
one of the ways that we do that without even realizing it is when you go home and you turn on your, whatever show it is, or you read whatever book you want to do, or you watch a documentary. You do that subconsciously with the plan to learn something new and become a better global citizen, even if you don't realize it.
Is there a way, again, this sort of, and I'll go back to Greta Thunberg, but we have tended to tell stories. There's this connection with the individual, which is obviously critical, and you have all spoken to that. But there's this other sort of social movement story, and certainly from the youth climate movement and the Friday strikes, etc., really took on an energy in a global life that sort of extended beyond that individual connection. So what might a social movement approach look like in ways that still bring in that individual and bring in the values and the optimism or the hope for being able to make a difference?
Oh, just what I find so powerful about these youth-led movements is the fact that they've just, for me, coming from a science background, they've just reminded, I think, everyone that you don't have to care and be passionate and incite change if you're just because you're not a climate scientist or an activist or an environmentalist. I mean, I think what the youth groups are doing so well is reminding everyone that everyone has a role, and not just that everyone's part of these movements, but we can use everyone's individual skills and work together. I mean, James, I'm preaching to the choir here, but to see, young musicians to help tell the story. And I just had a look at TikTok this morning. That's a whole other webinar, but I just, looked up the hashtag climate change, and it was so cool to see the different ways that the youth were communicating with themselves. One person got a ukulele out and had said a few lines about climate change, and then people all over the world were adding choruses based on that first person's beat. I mean, just ways that I would have never thought to continue to tell and incite change and inspiration. And I just love that they're capitalizing on everyone's different skills, whether it's a musician or a graphic artist or whatever you're interested in, whatever field or sector you're studying in. There's a way for everyone to be interconnected and to be on the same page. And I think the youth groups are doing that in an amazing way.
I'm just noticing a comment in the chat too about the role of schools helping to uncover and amplify those stories that connect and root us in our world and in these different values. And I think, you've mentioned, with the podcast or with the work that you're doing in the museum or in music, et cetera, the real power of these institutions that can also carry and amplify stories. When we think about the audience and broadly and people generally, we're all using the stories in our life in social media, TikTok, etc. So what strategies or suggestions do you have beyond what we've already talked about to start building those narratives, to start extending the reach? How can people effectively engage and contribute to this conversation in their own lives?
I think for me, it really starts with being aware of how you see yourself in the stories that you tell yourself. So I was talking with a fellow who's, he's a social change leader, and we were talking about climate change. And I said, so what are the stories you tell yourself? And he said, well, we only have one car, and I've started riding my bike to work. So I'm a good person, right? I'm doing the right thing. And he said, and that's how I justify not doing more, right? And so how do we see ourselves? Like the youth, the thing that I love about the youth is these days is they're fearless. And they see themselves as change makers. That is their identity. That's the role that they think that they have to play in society. And so the stories they're telling themselves are, I need to make things better because somebody else isn't doing it. And for me, that's very empowering. Whereas I think a lot of business leaders, political leaders, social leaders see themselves as needing to guard the status quo. Those are the stories they're telling themselves. I am the change denier. Right? It's not even that I'm a climate denier. I'm just a change denier because change is scary and I can't imagine a better future. So for me, the first step would be try to be really honest about what stories you're telling yourselves and how they inform your identity. And then think about who do you want to be and what stories will get you to that place.
Right. And I carry on the conversation. I want to open it up also to questions. If anyone that's listening has a question, they can either, I don't know if we can raise hands here or actually put it in the chat, and Christy or Karen will let us know. If you have it specific to a specific person on the panel, feel free to do that. I haven't seen any questions yet. Christy, have you?
There's one that just got popped in there by Ali. Knowing that this message needs to get out to everybody is a daunting task. One storyteller's approach is not for everyone. I'm curious as to how you all decide on how to narrow your approach to reach as many as you can, how to stay focused, and how you accept that you can't reach everyone?
Great question, Allie. James, do you want to jump in there?
Yeah, you know, for us here, the lessons of our people and our stories, we reach, we do what we can to reach and teach those lessons to the visitors that do come here. Many people, you know, not this year, but many people over time choose this as a destination for a multitude of different reasons. You know, the nature, the people, the Haida people, and when they do come here, we need to do our best to represent ourselves, and teach those lessons as they come. And so, you know, I bring people around Waihanis in a 15-person zodiac, and we go to my people's ancient village and many different other villages and many different places. And as they see that thing, as they are seeing the wonders of nature and the amazing skills of my ancestors carving around them, I'm telling the stories, right? You know, they're there with me all day. They're stuck with me. So as that's happening, I'm telling the stories, and whether or not they're listening is up to them. But you know, the stories that are there, I'm telling, and there's the lesson is broadly around us. As you're walking through nature, talking about the stories of change, it's really hard to ignore it. Just simple things like the introduction of deer in Haida Gwaii 100 years ago, having such an impact on the growth of cedar in our forests as an invasive species. They've destroyed the understory of the forest, and they eat seedling cedars, right? And in the last 100 years, it's been very difficult to grow new cedar because of the existence. And the simple fact of, you know, the simple lesson of it's not great to introduce a species is very evident as you're walking through nature with somebody telling about it. Then you can say, hey, look at the floor. There's no berries. There's no salal on the floor. This is just moss. And that might as well just be, you know, there's lots of life in moss, but as far as the forest floor goes, it might as well just be a desert. And so, yeah, I think that people seek out those stories. So for us, often it's, you know, it takes the step of that person seeking out that story, and we hope to, as they do come here, we hope to try to catch them nice and kindly and caress them on their way to a broader lesson of our territory. So,
thanks for that. How about you, Denise? How do you narrow the approach or the focus so you can reach as many as you can and stay focused?
Yeah, so I would say that's not the thing to do. So, you know, like great communication to design is about targeting an audience and designing your message specifically for that audience. And so the broader you try to get, the tougher it's going to be. And so for me, it comes back to, you know, knowing what your audience values, right? What matters to them? How do you make it meaningful and relevant to them? And if you try to tell one story for everybody, which is part of what I think we've been doing, you're only going to reach part of the audience for whom that's meaningful and relevant. So my advice would actually be, don't try to do that. You know, try to customize your storytelling as much as you can.
Johanna, thanks, Denise.
Yeah, I mean, up until now, until recently, I think that I was seeing a chance to reach a lot of people on a lot of different platforms as a chance to oversaturate. And, you know, I think my goal up until recently was to just try and make climate change, to normalize talking about climate change in whatever platform I was a part of. But I think, you know, recently myself and the newsroom are starting to think about this focused storytelling for different groups, really thinking about our listeners, and those stories do look different depending on who we're talking to and what platform. And I mean, that's advice that everyone can take, thinking about your own networks and who you speak to and who you interact with on a daily basis, even if it's just, you know, your own friends and family. It's figuring out how to, I mean, first of all, normalize talking about climate change. And I think that is there for most people and groups now, which is positive to see. But moving it forward, thinking about your own networks and maybe you want to expand out of those own networks. But I think the first step is figuring out how to talk about the story of climate change in your own circles.
Right, so this idea of customizing, and James, you talked very powerfully about this, sort of land-based and experiential stories. In effect, you are experiencing the story as you're living it. There's another question that's come up, and it's one that I share, which is, how do we do all the things that you've talked about, and have these stories of positive examples and that help people see themselves in ways that are empowered and can act, but also include these unavoidable climate impacts and the urgency of this situation we're in. So how do we include that and still maintain, it's this balance that even comes back to your early comment, Johanna, about I still like facts. And it's like, those facts are still really important, and the urgency and the unavoidable impacts are still important. So how do we bring that balance into stories in ways that don't sort of freeze people or overwhelm them?
I think there is a balance, as you mentioned, and interestingly, I've been thinking more and more about this idea of the dooms makers, or the people that are using the doomsday scenario as sort of the new form of, or the new climate denier. I mean, in a way, the voices that say it's too late, and here are the headlines, and everything from here on in is unavoidable. We've already hit the tipping point. That's almost worse now than climate deniers. And it's been interesting for me to see that new voice emerge and be the new challenge that we have to overcome. But if you look at the science, I mean, it's not too late. And that's where I think it comes back to the importance of science. We haven't hit the tipping points yet. There is still so much we can do to avoid the worst case scenarios. And I think that's why science storytelling and figuring out a way to weave the facts into a story is still so important, because it's, saying that we're too late for anything is just scientifically inaccurate.
Well, and if I can jump on that, when I teach storytelling, I say that stories only end one of three ways, right? The hero succeeds, the hero dies, or the hero gives up. And so if we're giving up, then the story is over and there is no story that we can really tell in the future. And this question makes me think about the role of fiction. I actually just read the book Dune a little while ago, and I don't know how many people know the story of Dune, but when you think about that, that's generations and generations of people conserving water, sacrificing for generations, conserving water because they have a shared dream and a shared vision of replanting their desert planet. Right. And that's what sustains them going forward. And then, talking about the kind of dystopian futures that we see in all of these doomsday scenarios, why aren't we talking about the Jetsons instead? Right. Or, Star Trek, or these future stories where we still live our lives and we're still very human, but we do it with some cool future technology and some cool future settings. So I think that there are ways to tell those stories and not avoid, not pretend that climate change isn't real and that the impacts aren't going to be there.
I can give you an example right over here about how we intertwine oral histories and then kind of hold them up with science. Just right here is an example. It starts with the story of Woodpecker, where he says the island was once all covered with grass, they say. Woodpecker was traveling upon it. He had no feathers. And in the middle of the island stood a large tree without bark, on which he began hammering. That's just a little section of the woodpecker story. And it taught, woodpecker's there, but it also talks about what the landscape looked like at a certain time with that grass, right? And so 18,000 years ago to 12,000 years ago, 14,000 years ago, the Hecate Strait in between Haida Gwaii and the mainland looked like a plains. It was kind of, if you look at the depth of the ocean there, it's usually no deeper than 100 feet. And that long ago, that the ocean was much lower. And so that was a plains. So underneath that paragraph, we have another paragraph that says, through analysis of soil patterns, scientists estimate that the ice from the last glacial episode, the Wisconsin glaciation, was retreating from the islands about 18,000 years ago, considerably earlier than the mainland due to the warming influence of Pacific currents. Additionally, portions of the Hecate Strait and areas along the west coast of Haida Gwaii are considered to have remained free of ice during the glacial epoch. Right, so we use that woodpecker story as a, you know, it's a longer story, but just that little excerpt, and it's describing something that previously hadn't been thought about what the landscape looked at that time. And then scientists started to, some of our scientist allies that are featured on that little thing there, they started to look at that story and then use it to guide their hypothesis about what different landscapes look like on the coast of BC. And through following that oral history as a guideline, they were able to sound villages under the Hecate Strait older than 14,000 years. And then in Celtic territory, I think they found some things that were over 15,000 years ago. So yeah, I mean, there are ways to intertwine them all and understand our Earth. And I think as we move forward into potential climate change, well, we are in climate change, but as we move forward into, you know, disasters becoming worse and understanding what it is to be a climate refugee, we need to understand the past and the way that humans evolved to different changes better. You know, I think there's still a lot of gray areas in really thoroughly understanding what we've been through as a species. So yeah, that's just, you know, that it just struck me when you thought about, you know, how do we back up science's story, or how do we back up story of science? And that's basically what this entire portion of our museum is about, is using story excerpts and then explaining it through scientific, you know, reasoning, what was happening in that climate and what's being spoken about.
Yeah, I mean, in effect, weaving together two narrative traditions, Western science and story-based Indigenous science, really. It also links into another question that's been raised in the chat room, and it sort of relates to what I was talking about, this sort of urgency versus positive. Is, you know, as I began the webinar today, was talking about there are unavoidable impacts, and we're already in that space. You know, experiencing greater wildfire action, droughts, extreme weather, et cetera, sea level rise, et cetera. So the dominant story in climate change in the media, in many, if not most contexts, is focusing on mitigation, emissions reduction, which is obviously critical. But we know that those impacts are happening and are going to be unavoidable and are going to be getting a lot worse over the next, you know, 20, 30, 40 years, longer, if we don't, you know, get our act together on the emission side. So how, you know, what about those adaptation stories that show us doing well, but you know, adapting basically in the context of these, and that example that you gave, James, is sort of a bit of that, you know, like where are the stories that help us understand how to, and the possibility of living in really extreme times. I'm thinking currently of the pandemic and the kinds of stories that have been happening in this context.
I would say, oh, sorry. I would say it's important to understand that, you know, just the very existence of the human species as we fly through space at warp speed on this spaceship, and the very existence is delicate, right? And we use a set of 6 guiding principles, and I can, you know, maybe I'm having some connection issues, but you know, the Haida people have a set of 6 guiding principles, and one of them is Gitfuljuice, which is balance. And when we speak about Gitfuljuice, it's realizing that the world that humans live on is as sharp as the edge of a knife, right? Where we are and where we've always been for all of human existence has been on that edge of the knife. And the way that we live our life in one direction or the other can tip us way off the edge. But to understand that the spaceship that we're on is going to survive into the future, and if we want to exist on this thing, in, you know, with it as it flies through time, we need to get the balance back and live on the edge of that knife, and you know, that's it. Just kind of brought me to that guiding principle, and I can share the further guiding principles if you'd like at another time, but it just reminded me of that. that example.
Yeah, thank you for that. Others, do you have thoughts on that question around this balancing act that we live and the stories that help us? There's been a couple more questions, the sort of the adaptation side, and even without framing climate change or human caused climate change as a positive thing, the possibilities inherent in that.
Yeah, I mean, I love that, James, and I do definitely want to hear the other guiding principles because that really resonates for me. Robin, as you and I have talked about, we're not doing adaptation very well right now, right? It's just, and that is the dominant narrative. I see adaptation as an amazing opportunity to address a lot of the other things that are plaguing society, like lack of connection, lack of community, lack of belonging. Figuring out how we're going to adapt our businesses, our homes, and our communities to climate change gives us a tremendous opportunity to say, we're all in this together. How are we going to come together and co-create this future? What do you want your town to look like? And that's happening here in my little town. We actually have a really strong official community plan, right? So what do you want your town to look like? What do you want our business to look like? What do we want our family home to look like? It's an opportunity to start to have those conversations that we haven't been having.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, we all belong. We all belong. The climate as a whole, the world's climate is a human. We're all global citizens. But any change in any example of a way to life is to bring it right down and realize that you're a climate of yourself, and you need to exist within that, balance yourself, and help inform your family and that broader climate around you, and then your city and your community and your city and your region. And because we're all a bunch of microclimates, and climate change isn't one big event happening, it's a bunch of small things happening around the world that are contributing to a larger thing. So
there's a number of people, including myself, that would love to hear those other guiding principles from you, James, if you want to share them briefly.
Sure. Yeah, this is when we're writing any sort of policy in our own government, the Haida Nation, the Council of the Haida Nation, or our marine planning, or if our children are in the schools, we try to have these guiding principles out there. And it's not unsimilar to any other kind of religion or culture around the world. Everybody has these guiding principles, and we all already know what the guiding principles are internally without setting them out, right? The first one, of course, is Kwahagang, which is respect to each other, all living things. Respect to each other and all living things is rooted in our culture. We take only what we need, we give thanks, and we acknowledge those who behave accordingly. And then the second one is Lagu Kuntlins, responsibility. And this one, it's that we accept the responsibility passed on by our ancestors to manage and care for our sea and land. And we will ensure that our heritage and our culture is passed on into the future, into future generations. So make sure that you're singing the songs and telling the stories to the youth around you so that they can do that into the future and have a ripple effect. And then the third one is Gina Wadluhan at Kwagidas, interconnectedness. And it's just reminding yourself that everything is connected to everything. There's, you know what I mean? In Haida culture, when we carve beautiful masks, it's not everything in this room right here. If there was a large potlatch comes on, our dance group takes these masks off the wall. This this beautiful mask carved by Reg Davidson, or that one by Jim Hart Adensu. They all come off the wall, and the stories that they tell, they get told in front of a potlatch of thousands of people. And the lessons that they represent from the deities that they represent, they get told to everybody, and the dancers around them. We hold up these big heavy masks and and we show them. So like just like a movie, everything, art, culture, language, everything is connected to everything. And all of those things can help us inform our ways into the future. And then the fourth one that I touched on, Getulju's balance, which is the world is as sharp as the edge of a knife. And that's, I feel like I've explained it, just understanding that our existence is here on this edge, and we're right now tipping off of it. But if we realize that soon enough, hopefully we can correct in the other direction and overcompensation and hopefully balance out. And maybe not in our generation, or maybe not in our living, but if we set examples and we help the future generations lead us, hopefully there will still be an existence for them. Then the fifth one is Gina Kwahagang Gi U Tol Kun Budang, seeking wise counsel. Our elders teach us about traditional ways and how to work in harmony. Like the forests, the roots of our people are intertwined. Together we consider new ideas and information in keeping our culture, values, and laws. And wise counsel, I consider that participating in, sharing space with you three wonderful women and learning from you and anybody else around us. So it's opening your mind up to everything, but also to the elders in your community or the youth in your community who are, we spoke earlier about using social media and understanding that social media is a tool that basically, if you're over the age of 30, you don't even understand it. You don't understand how it really works, right? And so in broadcasting messages, seeking wise counsel can also mean listening to the youth of today, and the examples that they set. I think about the youth like C.M. Hamilton and Takea Blaney, and the Indigenous youth that occupied the provincial legislature this year, early 2020, 10 years ago, or whatever it was. and I think about what they were saying and how they used social media to create that movement. They are our leaders, and they are the wise counsel that we should seek guidance from about how to exist into the future, because the future is theirs. It's not ours. And then the sixth one is Ista Adigi Ista, which is giving and receiving. Reciprocity is a respected practice in our culture, essentially in our interactions with each other and in the natural world. We continue to give thanks to the natural world for the gifts that we receive. This is always, this is as simple as, sometimes we throw tobacco, like trading tobacco on our fish hooks as an offering to the great one in the sea to hopefully be able to feed us. And whether or not that great one in the sea is going to really see my tobacco or not, but we need to ground ourselves in giving that offering in order to be ready to receive the gift of sustenance, right? So that's where I see that one is even if you don't think that your gift or anything like that, your offering is going to make a difference, it's going to make a difference in your heart, and it's going to make a difference in your mind, and remind yourself that you're taking the effort to make a change. So yeah, those are the 6 higher guiding principles.
Thank you for sharing those. And we're getting close to being out of time. So I'm just going to use those wise words and that generous sharing of them just as a way of closing. I want to hold on for a few minutes at the end to talk a little bit about some of the work that's happening around this, sort of extending this at Royal Roads. But any brief last thoughts, Johanna, that you'd like to share? We haven't got to all the questions, and I'll share those out and maybe try and get some answers or invite you to answer later. But
just to say that I've been incredibly inspired having this conversation. I'm always inspired listening to you, James. And I just wanted to share something that I learned from talking to Coast Salish people here in Vancouver. It's the idea that we are in our own story right now. And I have a son who is almost turning 2 years old. And, you know, the first sort of the past year, we were able to go through a whole season together and, you know, talking to Indigenous people about being reminded that the story we're in right now will not be the story that we're in a few decades. And the time of the year that, you know, my son and I went out to pick the salmon berries, and we saw the first birds, and we saw the course of the stream change. Those memories that I share with him right now will not be the same memories that he will share with his children. And there is sadness to that. The word is solastalgia, you know, the melancholy you feel for your home that's changing around you. And so much of that I've learned from the Indigenous communities. And it's a reminder that we have to celebrate the world around us and the story that we're in right now, but a reminder that it doesn't necessarily mean our future is a bad one. It's just going to be a different one, and we can celebrate that one too.
Yeah, thank you for those words. Denise?
Yeah, I think just for me, you know, one of the kind of guiding principles that I adopted about 20 years ago is this idea of appreciative inquiry, which is rather than focusing on what's broken, focusing on what we want more of. And so I would really encourage people to look around and say, you know, what is climate change bringing? What are these days? What is this time bringing to us? And thinking about their own lives and what they want more of, and really steering their own lives and their stories into that.
Thank you. Thank you all. Just sort of amazing, rich conversation that I know could carry on. I did want to mention that, you know, at Royal Roads, and this is a plug, but it's also to say that I think institutions like Royal Roads, educational businesses and stuff can all do their part. One of the things that we're doing to sort of change this narrative, and Christy, you might want to bring up the slide, is to offer a program in climate action leadership. And the goal of that program is really to attract diverse people, to build these interconnections that were spoken about, to bring some of these Indigenous values and wisdom into the thinking of students, working professionals, most of them who come into the program, who want to do more than follow the status quo, support the status quo, who want to really grow their capacity to influence and lead change through narrative and action and leadership and understanding the business and the science of climate, and really combining those ways of knowing and being in moving forward. It offers a one-of-a-kind sort of flexible approach and structure for people that are interested in really customizing their learning and becoming those climate action leaders and storytellers and change makers, really, in addressing this complex and wicked challenge of climate change, and doing so in ways that really, as all the speakers today have suggested, really lead us forward to the world that we want to live in, the world that we share, this amazing planet that we are part of, and you know, really celebrate the gifts that we are given and work together to ensure that those gifts are alive for generations to come. So thank you all, each one of you, and thank everyone that's come and attended to the webinar today. Christy, I'm going to turn it back to you. Well, maybe Christy isn't there. Anyway, well, we can finish off there. If you've got, if you have any questions about the program, or if you have other questions that weren't answered, if you can just put on the next slide, please. Oh, there we go. We'll just flip through these slides. If you want to learn more about the program, that's the website. You can see some podcasts, other storytellers who are sharing their stories of climate action and sharing their stories of what they believe needs to happen in this space and what can happen in this space. Next slide, you can, you know, reach out if you want to the enrollment advisors about that or any other programs. And as I said earlier, we will try and share some of the unanswered questions with the guests so that we can, they can answer them with you individually. So again, thank you all for attending, and be well and safe and enjoy this, at least here in British Columbia, glorious day.
Oh, for having us.